I'm going to talk about my transition from clinical practice to education. To start off, I'm just going to sort of give you a little bit about me and why I became a midwife, really, and then what really inspired me to transition into education. I'm going to talk a little bit about the learning curve because it was quite steep, and then a little bit about what happens with clinical practice. So hopefully that's going to be enough to sort of whet your appetites. So this is kind of my real passion about midwifery. So this is a photograph of my family. This is Annie. She's my great grandmother. And this is my grandmother, or Nanny as I used to call her. She was born in Blackburn in 1916. And a lot of our family stories are about these amazing men who went off to fight for their country in the First and Second World War. But Annie had 14 children. And my other grandmother on my father's side, they had 18 children. She had 18 children. So I was always really fascinated because they had all their babies at home. And, you know, they would have seen a big change because obviously the Midwife Act in 1902 would have come in and changed a lot of practice for midwives around that time. So I'd love to go back in time and just be able to ask them and talk to them. Because not really many of the stories are really told about them and you know, and what happened with their birth experiences. And as you said tonight, Sue, you know, women never forget the birth experience. And that brings me on to my birth. This is me. I was born in 1971, so just after the Peel report, where the recommendation was obviously for 100% hospital births based on safety. And it was up to the lovely Marjorie Chew in 1998, who really brought about our attention to the fact that that wasn't based on any robust evidence base. So, you know, we've got a lot to sort of thank Marjorie for in exposing some of that information. But my mum's experience was really not very compassionate at all either. She went in at the end of a night shift, which is always a mistake, to a really frosty reception from the midwives there. So she had a really, I think both of her birth experiences really lacked a lot of compassion, and comments and things were said to her that she's never forgotten. But then, you know, I had the call in to become a nurse and a midwife, obviously quite an early call in there. We recruit young. So I left St Helens, which is where I was born, best rugby league team, just get that in there. And I came to Derby, and I came to Derby because they did direct entry midwifery. And I actually ended up doing my nurse training, which I'm really glad I did. I loved my nurse training, made some exceptionally close friendships, a friend of which I currently am friends with. She was my mentor when I was a student nurse, and you know, she's been somebody who's also been a really strong influence in my career. So, and then, as you say, Sue, I went on to do my midwifery training, and you know, I trained to be a midwife. I worked in a number of rotational posts, but eventually found my place on labour suites, which I loved, intrapartum care, and really passionate about newborn life support. And I went on to do my masters because one of the things I really found that being newly qualified was really quite difficult and quite stressful. And I was really quite passionate to support those who also found it, you know, a quite stressful transition from being a senior student to being a junior midwife. So I used some of my master's research. The Trust were really receptive to some of the findings in how they could make their own preceptorship programme a little bit better. And that's something that I think led me on to sort of becoming a labour suite coordinator as well. And although I love being a labour suite coordinator, an opportunity came up at the University of Nottingham to take on a practice health lecturer role, which was a secondment where you work 50% of your time in practice and 50% of your time with the university. And that's when I got to meet some of these amazing people, really. So I was really lucky. You probably know some of these people by reputation, but I was really lucky to have someone called Maureen Rayner allocated to me as my mentor when I first came into education. And I really have got Maureen to thank for really giving me a really good grounding and establishing me as somebody who really wanted to be part of the education for midwives. And Maureen was there to sort of support me and give me lots of opportunities, to give me a really good taste during my secondment of midwifery education. And then I went on to apply for a substantive post, and Maureen was still there to help support me and give me the sort of, you know, the sort of experiences and support when it's tough. You know, somebody who to go to and be an ear, as well as somebody that was a mentor. And then you probably recognise some of these other people there who are just really inspirational people. So Professor Helen Spivey, who is, I still get a chance to work with Helen now. Helen was our head of midwifery for quite some time. And Helen's just been an incredible support, as well as being very inspirational. You know, her compassion, her warmth, and her, you know, her real sort of passion for sort of research and how that can sort of really support midwives, support women, has been something that, you know, is really really strong, and it really helps support you as an educator as well. So you know, she's been great. And Julia Allison is somebody that you may have heard of as well. Julia was one of our honorary assistant professors and was part of our module team. And I think Julia was somebody that really taught me that it doesn't matter how old you get, and I'm sure she won't mind me saying that, but you know, that to really just continue that drive and that passion. And Julia's done a lot of work in looking at you know, midwives from the past, you know, and sort of dispelling some of the myths around how midwives were perceived. And then there's Dennis, who I'm sure you also know by reputation, another person who's been quite a strong influence in some of my sort of my teaching and some of the learning that I've done throughout my education. So and Phil Ray, so the thing that all of those midwives have in common, Phil isn't a midwife, but it's just a real passion and enthusiasm for research, for midwifery education, and how that can be used to support midwives, to support women, you know, so midwives can advocate for women in their choices. But moving into education was quite a challenge. So Phil Ray is somebody who doesn't know me. Phil is a retired lecturer actually, but he's somebody that I've watched and listened to a lot in how to make myself a better educator, particularly around assessment, which I'll come on to in a little while. So the thing you need to know is that when I came into education, I've been in clinical practice for about 20 years. So it was very steep, the learning curve for me, particularly when COVID hit. But there are lots of social and political challenges, and it's very different to the NHS. You know, my relationship with my students became different. I wasn't a mentor anymore. I was an educator, but that did really afford me the opportunity to really get to know my students really well and offer sort of pastoral support. A contentious thing is the finances. So as you know, students have to pay fees now in order to train to be midwives, and that is quite a contentious subject. But it also can mean that students face some quite significant financial hardships. So that's something where the pastoral support really does sort of have a really big umbrella sort of effect. And the other thing I was really nervous about, I was really comfortable assessing students in clinical practice, but when it came to assessing students, when it came to the theoretical side, it was an area that I felt most vulnerable and exposed, because it wasn't something that I felt really confident with. And Maureen got me doing lots of shadow marking. She was somebody that you know, was a really good encourager in sort of like, you know, going with what I thought, but also following some of the guidance. And that's where Phil Race came back in. I've heard him talk quite a few times now, and he talks a lot about assessment and student feedback, and how a lot of the time students don't often read their feedback, they just look at the grade. So I've worked really hard to see how student feedback not only can feed into my the way I give feedback to students in their assessments and how they can do better, but also how that feedback can feed into my own style of education, you know, to make that better and easier for students. And then really another big passion of mine is women-focused education. So the steep learning curve is when you move into education, you lose that woman contact that you were so very used to. But I've been really lucky to work in a couple of roles where I've been sort of part of like public engagement into education, where women, you know, we can really pull them into that sort of, you know, helping us design the curriculums, you know, helping us with recruitment of our student midwives. And really just getting them to sort of, you know, step into the classroom and help us with some of our educational resources as well. And that's been really rewarding, I have to say. So the big question is, what about maintaining clinical practice? Well, for me, this was something that was really difficult. And when I took a substantive post, I knew that I was going to have to sort of step out of clinical practice full time. But I did try to maintain that. For about 2 years, I went into clinical practice and worked and continued to work as a labour suite midwife, but it got really quite challenging, and trying to maintain all the mandatory training, etc., was quite overwhelming, because the job in education is so big, and there isn't really anyone to hand those things over to. You kind of carry that workload yourself. So I found it very difficult. And this is where I spoke to a lot of my colleagues about that. Certainly people like Helen I borrow a quote from Helen Spivey about this, and it's, even though I'm an educator now, if you put me down the middle like a bar of rock, it would still say midwife inside. And I do borrow that from Helen quite a lot now. But I'm content with my role as an educator now, but I do miss clinical practice. And career opportunities and progression. So the one thing you need to think carefully of is planning it. So I had to take a step down in my salary when I came into education, and that's taken a while to get back to the level that it was at when I left. But the opportunities are really self-limiting. I've had some fantastic opportunities. I've had some collaboration with the Netherlands. I've been over there to do a couple of their conferences. We one of our module teams won a Lord Deering Award, which is a little bit like a mini Oscars for the university. And the wonderful Mandy, Wain, who you're about to hear now, we've done some really good dissemination of our work. So we're a bit of a YouTube hit on some of the obstetric emergencies that you might see, but also the opportunities for supporting students and getting them awards and getting them nominated for some of the RCN stuff too. And finally, this is what it's all about. So the people that do continue to inspire me is I work in an amazing team of other midwifery tutors and midwifery researchers. And I feel really lucky about that, because we get to support these guys out there and get to the end of their programme. And some of our students sacrifice such a lot, and they've got that passion to want to come and be midwives. And I wish you could see some of that, because it would make you so proud that our profession has got these amazing people coming into it who really do want to make a difference for women. So when we get to this day, they're often at graduation, they've been qualified for about 6 months and in their jobs. So we get to share some of this celebration time with them, that they've got to the end of that really long journey. And that is an exceptionally rewarding part of being a midwifery educator.